Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're pulling on our thickest, itchiest woolens and paddling a very leaky canoe deep into the 18th century Canadian wilderness. We're here to talk about a figure of legend, a man synonymous with rugged self-reliance and communing with the wild. The Hudson's Bay Company fur trapper. He's the stoic, buckskin-clad icon you've seen in paintings, gazing nobly into the middle distance. Well, we're here to tell you that the noble gaze was probably just snow blindness, and his biggest communion with nature was a daily, detailed negotiation on how it was planning to kill him. Because being a real HBC fur trapper wasn't about finding yourself. It was about losing your toes to frostbite, your supplies to a bear, and your mind to the crushing, silent, soul-obliterating loneliness of the bush. It was a life less noble savage, and more glorified frostbitten pest controller for a massive, unfeeling corporation. And for almost everyone who lived it, it absolutely, unequivocally, sucked. You've seen them in romantic frontier art and adventure novels. The master of the wilderness, his fringed jacket pristine, his canoe gliding effortlessly across a placid lake as a majestic moose looks on. He is one with the forest, a silent, knowing guardian of its secrets. Let's be clear. That man is a fantasy, likely cooked up by someone in a comfortable London office who considered a walk in the park to be a harrowing expedition. The reality of our man, let's call him Jean-Pierre or Angus or some other suitably rugged and unfortunate name, was nothing like a painting. His existence wasn't serene. It was septic. It wasn't noble. It was nauseating. It wasn't a spiritual journey. It was a grueling 17-month-long camping trip organized by your worst boss, where the only thing on the itinerary was back-breaking labor, the constant threat of a violent, lonely death, and a diet that would make a starving goat weep. The fringed buckskin jacket? After 3 weeks, it was a stiff, stinking carapace of dried sweat, animal fat, mud, and coagulated blood. That effortless glide across the lake? That came after a 10-mile portage, carrying 200 pounds of gear and a canoe on your spine-compressing shoulders, while being eaten alive by black flies the size of small birds. And the majestic moose? It's not looking on with quiet respect. It's wondering if you're weak enough to be stomped into a greasy smear on the landscape. Being an HBC trapper was a masterclass in suffering, a symphony of misery where the lead instruments were frostbite, starvation, rampant infection, and the kind of profound psychic isolation that makes you start having very serious, one-sided conversations with a beaver pelt. So, before we load up our canoe with existential dread and a truly offensive amount of unwashed wool, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. It costs you nothing, and it helps us continue our vital work of proving that nearly every job in history was, in fact, the worst job in history. And let us know in the comments, what one piece of modern technology do you think our trapper would have sold his soul for? A waterproof tent? Antibiotics? A flamethrower? The possibilities are endless and deeply depressing. All right. Find a comfortable spot, a true luxury our man Angus rarely, if ever, knew. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket that hasn't been used to clean a musket or staunch a wound. Settle into a chair that isn't a frozen log or a suspiciously damp patch of moss. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and prepare to paddle into the vast, silent, and spectacularly inhospitable heart of the 18th century Canadian wilderness. Try to enjoy the view. Our guy certainly didn't have the time. So how does a man like our Angus find himself 1,000 miles from anything resembling civilization, risking life and limb for a hat? It's a common misconception that the ranks of the Hudson's Bay Company were filled with proto-adventurers, thrill-seekers actively choosing a life of rugged excitement. That's a bit like assuming everyone who works in a sewer is a passionate spelunker. Number for the vast majority of men who signed on with the company. It wasn't a choice. It was an escape. You weren't so much born as you were funneled into the noble, frostbitten and quietly septic lineage of the fur trapper. Let's imagine Angus is from the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland, which was a prime recruiting ground for the HBC for over a century. Why? Because if you can survive a childhood in Orkney, the Canadian wilderness is basically just a lateral move in terms of general bleakness, but with more trees to hide behind when the wind is trying to peel the skin from your face. No privileged upbringing awaited our young Angus. No gentle schooling, no warm nursery, just the family's leaky croft, a legacy of inherited dampness, and the ever-present scent of salt, peat smoke, and sheep practically woven into his swaddling cloth. The choice for a young Orcadian man in the 18th century was what you might call a limited tasting menu of misery. Option A: become a tenant farmer, spending your life trying to coax oats out of a landscape that was 90% rock and 10% spite. Option B: become a fisherman, pitting your tiny, fragile boat against the homicidal fury of the North Sea. Or Option C: listen to the man from the Hudson's Bay Company. He'd appear once a year, this recruiter, a man who suspiciously seemed to own a coat without holes and boots with intact soles. He'd buy a round of ale in the local pub and spin tales of the Rupert's Land, a vast territory of limitless opportunity. He'd talk about the thrill of the hunt, the camaraderie of the voyageurs, and the chance to earn actual money, real coin, not just a share of half-starved fish. He spoke of a world of majestic forests and crystal-clear rivers, a world where a man could make his own way. And this is where that 10% of awe comes in, the glimmer of light that makes the coming darkness so profound. For a young man whose entire world was a windswept rock, the idea of a continent-spanning forest was intoxicating. The promise wasn't just money, it was space. It was the chance to escape the crushing smallness of island life and the rigid class structure of Britain. For a glorious, fleeting moment, the Canadian wilderness wasn't a death trap, it was a blank page. The recruiter, of course, strategically omitted the footnotes about the swarms of biting insects, the soul-crushing isolation, the rampant scurvy, and the fact that the crystal-clear rivers would freeze solid for 6 months, daring you to even look at them the wrong way. He sold a dream, and for a desperate young man, that was enough. So, you signed the contract, a legally binding document that you, being likely illiterate, would have signed with an X that pledged 5 to 7 years of your life to a faceless company an ocean away, in exchange for a tiny annual salary, most of which you'd never see. From the moment you could walk without immediately falling into a bog, you were put to work. Your early training for the brutal life in Canada was, simply, your childhood. By age 10, you were cheap, expendable labor on the farm or the boat. Your toys? Not carved soldiers, but a length of fishing line, a dull knife for gutting herring, and a particularly well-balanced rock for throwing at gulls. Your playground? A sheer cliff face overlooking a churning sea, a perpetually damp field, and the squelching, treacherous expanse of the local peat bog. While other more fortunate children were learning their letters, you were mastering the grim arts essential for survival, how to read the weather in the color of the sky, how to find shellfish when the larder was empty, how to set a snare for a rabbit, and how to ignore the gnawing ache of perpetual hunger. Fun games included Don't Get Washed Out to Sea, Find the Dry Peat, and the seasonal favorite, Let's Huddle Together So We Don't Freeze. Once you arrived in the new world, fresh off a vomit-caked, 2-month sea voyage, you were assigned your real instructor. Your primary mentor in this vast, woody school of hard knocks was likely an older, seasoned trapper, a man named Toussaint or McTavish, whose face was a leathery, sun-cracked roadmap of every bad winter since 1720. His vocabulary was as sparse as the winter vegetation, consisting mainly of grunts, creatively repurposed curses, and the occasional terrifyingly calm pronouncement of impending doom. He taught you everything not through patient explanation, but through brutal pragmatism and what we might today call experiential learning. He didn't tell you the ice was thin. He watched you take a step, and when the freezing water swallowed you to your waist, he'd mutter, "Aye, that," before showing you how to build a fire with numb fingers before gangrene claimed them. He taught you how to set a trap line, not by drawing a map, but by walking you for 10 miles through dense woods, and then leaving you to find your own way back, with the clear, unspoken understanding that if you failed, your remains would provide a modest meal for a wolverine. His only form of praise was the absence of a swift cuff to the back of the head. He was a terrifying, miserable, and profoundly unpleasant man. And if you paid attention, he was the only reason you survived your first year. Holidays, weekends, paid sick leave, these were adorable concepts, about as common for our 18th century trapper as a silk pillow or a warm bath. The wilderness didn't operate on a 5-day work week, and your contract with the Hudson's Bay Company didn't include a clause for mental health days, unless you counted the periods of delirium brought on by high fever, which, to be fair, were frequent. No, your schedule was dictated by the only authority that mattered, the seasons. Each one was a different project manager, with its own unique and sadistic set of performance expectations. A day in the heart of winter began not with a gentle sunrise, but with the cold, grudging realization that you had, against the odds, survived the night. Waking up was less a refreshing transition, and more a painful rebooting of a frozen system. The first task was always fire, not for a cheery ambiance, but as a direct refutation of death. Every spark coaxed from flint and steel was a tiny victory against the vast, indifferent cold that was actively trying to leach the life from your bones. Your breakfast, assuming you had one, was a study in gastronomic despair. It might be a chunk of bannock, a simple flour and water bread cooked on a stick, now frozen to the consistency of a petrified rock, which you'd thaw by the fire until it was merely rock hard and slightly smoky. Or perhaps a few spoonfuls of pemmican, a delightful brick of dried, pounded meat mixed with rendered fat, and if you were lucky, some shriveled, flavorless berries. It was less a meal and more a strategic calorie deposit, designed to provide just enough fuel to keep your body from cannibalizing itself before lunch. Then it was straight to the primary mode of labor, checking the trap line. This wasn't a brisk morning walk. This was a grueling, multi-mile trek on clumsy, heavy snowshoes through a landscape that actively resisted your presence. Every step was a calculation. Every snow-covered log was a potential broken ankle. Every gust of wind felt like a physical blow, driving icy particles into any exposed sliver of skin. You'd spend hours moving through this crushing silence, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight on your eardrums, broken only by the squeak crunch of your snowshoes and the ragged sound of your own breathing. The work itself was a grim routine of hope and horror. An empty sprung trap meant a wasted trip and a day closer to starvation. A trap containing your target, a beaver, a marten, a fox, was a success, but one that came with its own grim tasks. You might have to dispatch a still-living animal, a messy, brutal business. Then you had to free the frozen carcass from the steel jaws of the trap, with fingers that were rapidly losing all feeling. You'd haul the stiff, heavy bodies back to your hut, a miserable hovel that was less a home and more a crude shelter for processing corpses. The rest of your day, and many days after, would be spent skinning, scraping, stretching, and curing the pelts. It was smelly, bloody, exhausting work, performed in flickering firelight, turning your tiny cabin into a charnel house that smelled like a zookeeper's nightmare. And the environment itself wasn't a passive backdrop, it was the main antagonist. The Canadian wilderness of the 18th century wasn't so much a benevolent Mother Nature as it was a capricious, cold-hearted tyrant with a mean streak and a very inventive imagination for torment. The sun, Oh, the glorious sun! It was less a source of gentle warmth and more a distant, passive-aggressive celestial body. It would hang low in the sky, glaring at you with all the heat of a dying ember, its main purpose being to create a blinding, featureless landscape of white that seared your retinas and offered the delightful affliction of snow blindness. The wind wasn't a refreshing breeze. It was a physical manifestation of malice, a razor-sharp exhalation from the lungs of a frost giant, seeking out every gap in your clothing with the skill of a surgeon. And the silence was a living thing. It would press in on you, day after day, week after week, until the sound of your own heartbeat was a deafening drum, and you'd start to hear whispers in the rustle of the pines. And yet, and this is crucial to understanding why a man might not immediately lie down in the snow and give up, amidst all this active malevolence, there were moments of such profound, terrifying beauty that they could stop your heart. On a clear, impossibly cold night, the sky would explode with the aurora borealis, silent, shimmering curtains of green and violet light dancing across the heavens. It was a light show for an audience of one, a cosmic spectacle so grand and so utterly indifferent to your tiny, shivering existence that it was both humbling and horrifying. There were mornings of absolute stillness after a fresh snowfall, when the entire world was muffled and pure, the laden branches of the spruce trees turning the forest into a vast, silent cathedral. In these moments, you felt the sheer, awesome, inhuman scale of the world. It wasn't comforting. It didn't make you feel welcome. But it was majestic. It was a fleeting, powerful reminder that you were a part of something vast, even if you were just the part that was about to freeze to death. But these moments were rare exceptions in a sensory landscape of pure misery. The sounds of your life were a symphony of suffering, not loud noises, but a tapestry of quiet dread. The sudden sharp crack of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of ice, a sound exactly like a rifle shot that would send your heart into your throat. The distant, lonely howl of a wolf pack, raising the question of exactly how distant was. The maddening, high-pitched whine of a single mosquito that had somehow survived in your cabin, performing aerial acrobatics around your head as you tried to sleep. The dominant physical discomfort was a constant, a dull hum of pain beneath everything else. It was the feeling of wearing clothes that never truly dried, that perpetually clung to you with a damp, chilling embrace. It was the ceaseless, itching, burning agony of chilblains on your fingers, toes, and ears. It was the permanent sting of wood smoke in your eyes, and the unique sensation of your own beard turning into a solid block of ice from your frozen breath. And the smells. Oh, the smells. Let us compose a love letter to the olfactory landscape of the trapper's cabin, an ode to misery for the ages. The bass note was damp, musty wool, and the sour tang of unwashed human sweat. Layered upon this was the greasy, cloying odor of rendered animal fat, the coppery sharpness of old blood, and the pervasive, pungent funk of wet fur. Add to that the rich, loamy scent of the dirt floor, the sharp smell of pine smoke, and the faint, sweetish undertone of a pelt that was beginning to rot. It was the scent of survival, a thick, inescapable perfume that clung to your clothes, your skin, and your very soul. You didn't just live in it, you became it. In the profound and hostile isolation of the Canadian bush, a man is only as good as his equipment. Unfortunately for our Angus, his equipment was a motley collection of 18th century technology that was often stubborn, fragile, and occasionally seemed to be actively conspiring against him. These weren't the sleek, reliable implements of modern survival. They were moody, high-maintenance extensions of his own will that had a nasty habit of throwing in the towel at the worst possible moments. Let's start with his primary means of both defense and dinner acquisition, the flintlock musket. On a good day, it was a miracle of engineering, capable of turning a distant moose into a future week's worth of calories. On a bad day, which is to say, any day it was raining, snowing, foggy, or just Tuesday, it was a 10-pound temperamental iron tube with all the lethal potential of a wet dishcloth. The loading process alone was a Baroque 17-step ritual that was difficult in the best of conditions and a frantic, fumbling nightmare when a very large, very angry bear was closing the distance. You had to measure the powder, ram the ball, prime the pan. A single mistake or a damp patch of powder, and your reward for all that effort was a pathetic fizz instead of a life-saving boom. Your musket didn't just fail you, it had a flair for dramatic irony, choosing to become a useless club at the exact moment you needed it to be a firearm. Then there was the axe. If the musket was the fickle aristocrat of his toolkit, the axe was its brutally honest, working-class brother. It was his furnace, his house builder, his icebreaker, and in a pinch, his last line of defense. It didn't misfire. It didn't jam. Its purpose was clear and visceral. And this is where you might find a sliver of genuine connection, a moment of that grim satisfaction we mentioned. A well-sharpened axe, heavy and perfectly balanced in your hands, was a thing of beauty. The clean, percussive thwack of the blade biting deep into a frozen log was one of the few truly satisfying sounds in a world of miserable noises. But that satisfaction was conditional. An axe head could loosen, or worse, the wooden handle could snap in the brutal sub-zero temperatures, instantly transforming your most reliable friend into another liability, another urgent, life-threatening repair job, in a world made entirely of urgent, life-threatening repair jobs. And let's not forget the tools of his actual trade, the traps. Heavy, iron-jawed gin traps designed to snap shut with bone-breaking force on the leg of an unsuspecting beaver. They were marvels of cruel efficiency. They were also utterly indiscriminate. The trap didn't care if the limb that triggered its pan belonged to a furry woodland creature or the man trying to set it. A moment of distraction, a slip on an icy patch while stomping it into the snow, and you could be the proud owner of a mangled hand or a shattered ankle, 100 miles from anyone who could hear you scream. The traps were your source of income, but every time you set one, you were making a small wager with your own well-being. As for his state-of-the-art personal protective equipment, it consisted primarily of a wool capote, which is basically a hooded blanket masquerading as a coat. It offered about as much protection from a full-blown blizzard as a strongly worded suggestion. Wool is a miracle fiber when it's dry, but once soaked, and you were always getting soaked, it became a heavy, sodden shroud that seemed to actively suck the warmth from your body. Your footwear, buckskin moccasins, were brilliant for moving silently through the forest. They were significantly less brilliant for walking on sharp ice, wading through half-frozen streams, or offering any meaningful resistance to frostbite. They were essentially leather socks, daring the environment to do its worst. And yet, despite this daily catalog of failures and frustrations, these tools were your life. You cursed the musket for its temperamentality, but you also spent hours hunched by the fire, meticulously cleaning its lock and polishing its barrel with a tenderness you'd never show another human being. You'd curse the canoe, a magnificent but fragile creation of birch bark, cedar, and spruce gum, another piece of that sublime but terrifying wilderness. Every time a submerged rock threatened to rip its delicate skin, then you'd spend the next 2 hours patiently patching the wound with heated pine pitch, sealing the gash against the cold, dark water that wanted to swallow you whole. It was an unholy matrimony, a bond forged in shared misery and mutual disrespect. Your survival depended on your intimate knowledge of their every weakness, every quirk, every infuriating flaw. You had to care for them, mend them, and maintain them not out of love, but because your life was balanced on their flawed and fragile integrity. They were your constant burden and your only hope, your tormentors and your saviors, all at the same time. If you were to ask our man Angus about his health and wellness plan, he'd likely stare at you with a profound and weary confusion before going back to trying to chew a piece of dried moose jerky that had the texture of a roofing shingle. The life of an HBC trapper was a systematic, slow-motion dismantling of the human body, an accelerated course in anatomical decay. By the time he reached what a pampered European noble might consider his prime, say 30 years old, our trapper's body was already a living museum of occupational hazards, a roadmap of pain drawn by years of relentless abuse. His spine, once the straight, strong column of a young man, would have likely begun to resemble a gnarled oak branch. Years of portaging, lugging 100-pound packs of furs and equipment, with a 60-pound canoe balanced on top for good measure, had a way of compressing a man's vertebrae into a permanent, agonizing cringe. Hernias were not a risk. They were a near inevitability. His joints, perpetually damp and cold, would sing arias of agony every morning, a condition we'd call severe arthritis, but which he would have just called waking up. And his hands. Oh, his magnificent, ruined hands. They were less appendages of flesh and blood, and more a pair of biological tools shaped by misery. The skin was a tapestry of scars from errant knives, rope burns, and the jagged edges of traps. The knuckles were swollen, the fingernails often blackened or missing entirely from a poorly aimed hammer blow. Years of gripping an axe handle and a paddle had given him a powerful grasp, but also a permanent, painful set of calluses and a network of deep, dirt-filled cracks. They were the hands of a man who worked, and they hurt, constantly. But it wasn't just the spectacular, grinding injuries of hard labor that wore him down. Oh no. The wilderness was also a prolific and creative distributor of fascinating internal afflictions. The most famous and feared of these was scurvy. We think of it as a pirate's disease, a quaint problem of bleeding gums. The reality was a horror show. It began with a profound lethargy, a bone-deep weariness that made every task monumental. Then came the pain in the limbs, the blotchy skin, and yes, the gums, which would become spongy, purple, and bleed at the slightest touch, your teeth loosening in their sockets like pebbles in wet sand. The most terrifying symptom? Old wounds, even those that had been healed for years, would spontaneously reopen, the body literally starting to come apart at the seams. It was a slow, painful dissolution, a death by nutritional deficiency that haunted every winter camp. The only cure was vitamin C, turning the acquisition of spruce tips for tea or a handful of wild berries from a dietary choice into a desperate matter of life and death. And let's not forget the sheer joy of the 18th century trapper's diet on his digestive system. The endless meals of dried meat and fat, when not leading to constipation that could last for a week, were often prepared with water from a stream that a deer had died in a mile upstream. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was a frequent and unwelcome visitor to his lonely cabin. There are few circles of hell more specific than suffering from explosive, debilitating diarrhea while it is 40 degrees below zero outside your one-room shelter. While his body was engaged in this constant losing battle against both external forces and internal rebellion, his mind was fighting its own silent, desperate war. The physical dangers were at least tangible. The mental strain was a ghost, an invisible pressure that could crush a man flat. The primary enemy was the silence, the sheer crushing weight of absolute solitude. After weeks and months of hearing no human voice but your own, the mind starts to play tricks. The wind in the pines begins to sound like whispers. You start having detailed out-loud conversations with your axe. You might give a name to a particularly plump beaver you're tracking. It wasn't madness, not at first. It was a coping mechanism, a way to populate the vast, screaming emptiness of the world with something other than yourself. Then there was the ever-present hum of low-grade fear. It wasn't the stark terror of a bear attack. That was at least a straightforward, honest threat. It was the chronic, corrosive anxiety of listening. Listening for the snap of a twig that meant something was outside your cabin. Listening to the groan of the lake ice, wondering if it would hold your weight today. Listening for the sound of your own breathing becoming ragged. A sign that the lung rot of pneumonia was setting in. It was the exhaustion of perpetual vigilance. Yet you couldn't survive this life if you were fragile. And here, in the deepest pit of misery, we find that strange, resilient glimmer of the human spirit. Our trapper did not have access to therapy, but he did develop one of the most powerful psychological defenses known to man. A profound, unshakable, and deeply cynical stoicism. His inner world likely became a fortress of stoic resignation, punctuated by flashes of impotent anger or a bleak, weary cynicism that would curdle milk. He didn't have the luxury of despair. Despair didn't chop firewood. He couldn't afford a nervous breakdown. A breakdown didn't check the trap line. So he learned to endure. He learned to pack his fear and his loneliness down into a small, hard, cold knot in the pit of his stomach and simply continue. This wasn't a form of happiness, not even close, but it was a form of strength. It was the development of a mental hide as thick and scarred as the leather he worked with. He didn't conquer his suffering, he learned to carry it. He became a connoisseur of misery, able to differentiate between the different flavors of agony with the palate of a master sommelier. And in that brutal, unyielding endurance, in that stubborn refusal to just lie down and die, there was a kind of terrifying, awe-inspiring resilience. He was a man worn down to his very essence. And that essence, it turned out, was tougher than rock. For months on end, the only real social interaction our man Angus had was with himself, his tools, and the occasional squirrel he'd accuse of hiding his flint. After so long in the crushing solitude of the bush, the very concept of other people becomes warped and strange. You'd think that any human contact would be a welcome relief. And sometimes it was. But more often than not, dealing with other people was just a different, more complicated, and frequently more infuriating brand of suffering. People, it turned out, could be just as treacherous as thin ice, and far more judgmental. His human interactions fell into three distinct, often overlapping categories: the company, the competition, and the original inhabitants of the land. First and foremost, there was the company. The Hudson's Bay Company wasn't a person, of course. It was something far more terrifying. A vast, faceless, and utterly dispassionate corporate entity that viewed him not as a man, but as a number on a ledger, a line item in the grand centuries-long project of turning beaver pelts into European banknotes. His direct interactions, however, were with the company's men, the human cogs in this great cold machine, stationed at the trading post, a place like York Factory or Moose Factory, a grim, palisaded pimple of civilization clinging to the edge of an unforgiving bay. The king of this miserable little castle was the chief factor. This was the man Angus would see perhaps once a year when he paddled his canoe, laden with the fruits of his year-long agony, back to the post. The factor was a different species of human. While Angus was a gaunt, sinewy figure, his skin turned to leather by wind and sun, the factor was often a man enjoying the modest benefits of a desk job. He might be slightly paunchy, his face pale from a life spent indoors poring over shipping manifests and profit and loss statements. He wore actual shoes, with buckles, a staggering display of luxury. He smelled not of blood, grease, and wood smoke, but of ink, paper, and faint, imported tobacco. He was the regional manager of this entire frozen hellscape, and his primary concern was the bottom line. The annual meeting with the factor was a masterclass in ritualized humiliation. Angus would haul his year's catch, dozens, perhaps hundreds of meticulously prepared pelts, into the trading room. Each one represented days of backbreaking work, a victory against starvation, a successful battle against the cold. To Angus, they were his life's work. To the factor, they were inventory. He would pick up a prime beaver pelt, the fur thick and glossy. Angus would feel a flicker of pride. Then the factor would hold it up to the light, his lip curling slightly. "A bit sparse on the flank, McTavish," he might say, his voice a dry rustle of condescension. "And what's this?" "A scar near the eye. Careless dispatching. That will have to be discounted." He'd toss it onto a pile, his clerk making a neat little note in a heavy leather-bound book. He would go through the entire pile like this, finding fault in every masterpiece, devaluing a man's entire year of suffering with a sigh and a flick of the wrist. Every imperfection, real or imagined, was a justification to dock the trapper's pay, ensuring that after his accounts were settled, he remained firmly, inextricably in debt to the company. He had arrived hoping to clear his balance. He would leave with his supplies for the next year, another mountain of debt on his shoulders, shackled to the trade for another cycle. And oh, that clerk. If the factor was the distant cold god of this domain, the clerk was his weaselly, power-tripping archangel. He was often a younger man, perhaps a failed nephew of a company official, who wielded his tiny scrap of authority like a cudgel. He was the one who managed the storehouse, the Fort Knox of flour, gunpowder, shot, and rum. When Angus, having been fleeced by the factor, had to procure his outfit for the next season, it was this clerk he had to deal with. He'd stand at a high desk, looking down his nose as Angus requested his supplies. "Another 50 pounds of flour? You went through the last lot rather quickly, didn't you, Angus? One must be efficient." Every item was doled out with a sneer, a reminder that this wasn't a purchase, it was a loan. It was charity from the great and powerful company, and the interest rate was Angus's own soul. But once a year, the fort also hosted the second category of human, his fellow sufferers. The annual rendezvous was a chaotic, cathartic explosion of humanity. Dozens of men like Angus, streaming in from their lonely outposts, their canoes low in the water with furs. For a few weeks, the oppressive silence of the bush was replaced by a cacophony of Gaelic, English, French, and Cree. And here, in this maelstrom of desperation and temporary relief, you could find the closest thing to friendship this life offered. This is where that flicker of positive human connection was allowed to catch flame. It wasn't about deep emotional conversations. It was a camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared trauma. It was sitting on a crate with a man you hadn't seen in a year, sharing a clay pipe filled with precious tobacco, and simply nodding, a universe of understanding passing between you in that silence. It was the rough, barking laughter at a joke so dark it would make a gravedigger blush, a story about a particularly stupid way a man almost died, told with the punchline, "And the bear got my last good hat." It was the collective, unspoken hatred of the factor. It was the rare, precious bottle of rum passed from hand to hand, each man taking a fiery swig that burned away a thin layer of the accumulated misery. In these moments, you weren't a cog in a machine. You were part of a grim, exclusive brotherhood. You were one of the few who knew what it was really like out there, and that knowledge bound you together more tightly than any contract. Of course, this temporary utopia of the damned had its dark side. Pent-up aggression, fueled by rum and perceived slights, could erupt into brutal, clumsy fistfights. And there was always the quiet suspicion. Resources in the wild were finite. While you might share a drink with a man at the fort, if you encountered him on a remote river system, you'd wonder, is he checking my trap line? Is he spooking the game in my territory? The company did little to discourage this, as competition often led to higher fur counts. So even your brothers in misery were also, in a very real sense, your rivals. This rivalry was even more pronounced with the true competition, the men of the Northwest Company. These were the enemy, mostly French-Canadian coureurs de bois or Scottish Highlanders defeated at Culloden. They were seen by the HBC men as a different breed. They were more flamboyant, more comfortable in the wilderness, often intermarrying with indigenous women and adopting their ways with an ease that the more rigid, Protestant HBC men found vaguely scandalous. An encounter in the wild was a moment of high tension. Two canoes, one bearing the HBC standard, the other the NWC's, might pass on a lake. No words would be exchanged, just hard, silent stares. A mutual sizing up, a cold assessment of numbers and weaponry before each party continued on its way. It was a cold war fought with paddles and hostile glares in the heart of the continent. Finally, and most importantly, there was the third and most complex human element. The first peoples of the land, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Dini. Angus was an intruder in their world, a clumsy, ignorant amateur in an environment they had mastered over millennia. His entire existence depended on their technology. The birch bark canoe he paddled, the snowshoes that kept him from sinking into the snow, the moccasins on his feet, the very roots he followed, all were the products of indigenous genius. Without them, he would have died within a week. Interactions were a delicate dance of necessity, trade, and profound cultural misunderstanding. He might, in the depths of winter, his own supplies dwindling, stumble upon a Cree encampment. Driven by desperation, he would have to trade. He would offer iron pots, axe heads, or gunpowder, the few things he had that they desired, in exchange for what he desperately needed: fresh caribou meat, a pair of expertly crafted snowshoes to replace his own broken ones, or life-saving knowledge about where to find a specific medicinal plant. These interactions would be fraught with tension, conducted through a mixture of broken trade jargon and elaborate hand gestures. He was a guest, a customer, and a potential threat, all at once. And here, again, was a source of that awe that punctuated the misery. To watch a Cree hunter move through the forest was to witness true mastery. He made no sound. He read the landscape like a book Angus could barely spell. He was part of the world, while Angus was merely fighting it. This sight would have inspired a deep, grudging respect, a professional admiration for their incredible skill and resilience. It was a humbling, powerful lesson that he, for all his corporate backing, was a child in this land. And with that awe came a sliver of unease, a quiet, unacknowledged guilt. He was an agent of a force that was irrevocably changing their world, trading addictive rum, and creating dependency, all for the sake of a fashion trend an ocean away. He was both reliant on their generosity and an instrument of their disruption. It was a complex, uncomfortable truth that he would have packed down with all the other unpleasant thoughts required to simply get through the day. The modern concept of self-care would have been utterly, bafflingly alien to our 18th century trapper. His life was a masterclass in self-neglect, a long-form study in just how much privation the human animal can endure before it simply gives up. The fundamental pillars of a comfortable existence, good food, a warm home, and a decent night's sleep, were not just absent. They were replaced by cruel, parodic imitations that seemed designed to mock the very idea of comfort. Dining, sheltering, and resting in the world of Angus MacTavish was a culinary and architectural tour of despair. Let's begin with the grim sustenance that fueled this miserable enterprise. His diet was not about pleasure, variety, or nutrition in any modern sense. It was a brutal, monotonous calculus of caloric intake versus energy expenditure. At the heart of this diet was the unholy trinity of trail foods, chief among them being pemmican. To call pemmican food is a technicality. It was, more accurately, a strategic survival substance, Imagine taking dried stringy meat, venison, moose, whatever you could get, and pounding it into a coarse fibrous powder. Now, mix that meat dust with an equal amount of hot, rendered animal fat. Toss in a handful of dried crushed choke cherries or Saskatoon berries if you're feeling particularly festive, and then press the whole greasy, gritty concoction into a solid brick inside a rawhide bag. The result was a waxy, brownish-purple block with the aesthetic appeal of a mummified organ and the texture of a tallow candle mixed with sawdust. It was a miracle of preservation. It would not spoil for months, even years, mostly because it was so profoundly unappetizing that even the most ambitious bacteria would likely take one look and decide to move on. You could gnaw on a cold chunk of it, the fat coating your mouth and teeth in a greasy film, or you could boil it in water to create a thin, glistening, and utterly nauseating soup known as rubaboo. Pemmican was the taste of pure function, the flavor of grim necessity. It would keep you alive, but it would never ever make you happy to be so. The second pillar of his diet was bannock, or as he might have known it, the rock of life. A simple, unleavened bread of flour, water, a pinch of salt if available, and maybe a little lard. It was cooked on a stick over the fire, or fried in a pan of grease. Fresh off the fire, it was a legitimate luxury. Hot, smoky, and doughy, the most comforting thing he might eat in a month. But that state of grace was fleeting. Within a day, it would become tough and chewy. Within 3, it would achieve a geological density, a petrified disk that could be used to knock a squirrel unconscious at 20 paces. This stale bannock was his plate, his spoon, his sponge for mopping up the grease from a piece of fried meat. It was an edible utensil, and like everything else in his life, it was hard, unforgiving, and multi-purpose. And this is where we find those rare, explosive moments of joy that make the rest of the suffering bearable. After weeks of nothing but the waxy misery of pemmican and the stony indifference of old bannock, the experience of eating fresh meat was nothing short of religious. Imagine the sound, the glorious, life-affirming sizzle of a freshly killed grouse or rabbit hitting a hot, greased pan. That sound was hope. The aroma of roasting meat filling his tiny, smoky hovel was the most beautiful perfume in the world. And the taste of hot, savory, juicy flesh was an explosion of pure animal pleasure, a reminder that he was a predator, a creature of blood and instinct, not just a machine for processing pemmican. These moments were rare, powerful, and intensely private celebrations of a successful hunt. They were the dividends of his hard work, paid out in fat and protein, and they were glorious. As for his accommodations, the term rustic charm does not begin to cover the sheer, unadulterated grimness of his winter lodgings. His home was not a cozy log cabin from a postcard. It was a tilt, a crude shelter, often built against a rock face or a large fallen tree. It was a small, cramped hovel of hastily felled logs, often with only 3 walls, the 4th being an open face towards the fire. The gaps between the logs were chinked with a mixture of moss, mud, and frozen despair, a combination that was never quite airtight. Let's take a tour. The front door was usually a stiff, poorly tanned animal hide that flapped in the wind, or a few rough planks that left a permanent half-inch gap, inviting snow, drafts, and small, curious animals to come on in. The single window, if he was so ambitious as to have one, was not glass, but a piece of stretched caribou intestine or a fish's air bladder, scraped thin and oiled. It let in a smear of gloomy jaundiced light, but offered all the panoramic view of a cataract's afflicted eye. The floor was the cold, hard-packed earth, which would turn to mud during a brief thaw and then refreeze into a lumpy, ankle-twisting surface of frozen dirt. His bed, the pinnacle of domestic comfort, was a pile of spruce boughs laid in a corner. These provided a modicum of insulation from the frozen ground and a delightful pine scent for the first night, after which they mostly provided a network of sharp, pointy sticks to dig into his back and hips. On top of this went his bedding, a single perpetually damp wool blanket, or perhaps a heavy greasy buffalo robe. This bedding was not just his. It was a thriving ecosystem, a vibrant community of lice and fleas who were his constant itching companions. Privacy was a concept as alien as a pineapple. And all this brings us to the final luxury, rest. The notion that night was for 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep was a charming fairy tale told in some other warmer world. Sleep for Angus was a series of aborted engagements, a commodity constantly being stolen from him by the world, his work, and his own body. Even if he managed to exhaust himself into a state of near unconsciousness, the night was filled with interruptions. The forest was not quiet. There was the sharp crack of a frost-riven tree that sounded exactly like a musket shot. There was the blood-chilling scream of a hunting lynx, the mournful howl of a wolf pack that sounded just a little closer than it did last night, or the heavy, snuffling sound of a large, hungry animal investigating his food cache just outside the wall. Each sound was an alarm bell, jolting him from the shallowest of sleeps into a state of heart-pounding, wide-eyed vigilance. If the world outside didn't wake him, his own body would. The dull, throbbing ache in his arthritic knees would sharpen into a piercing agony in the deep cold. A racking cough, born of a lifetime of smoke inhalation and damp, cold air, would shake his entire frame. The maddening, crawling itch of his louse-ridden clothes would become an unbearable torment in the stillness of the night. Sleep was not a refuge. It was just a different venue for his suffering. Deep restorative slumber was the rarest of treasures, a forgotten relic of a past life. He didn't sleep so much as he periodically lost consciousness, only to be dragged back to the waking world by a new and inventive form of discomfort. In the entire frozen expanse of Rupert's Land, there was no god more powerful, more capricious, or more mercilessly worshipped than the god of commerce. Our man Angus may have been an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, but it would be a grotesque mischaracterization to say he earned a wage. The concept of a regular payday involving the cheerful clinking of silver coins was for him a delightful fiction. Instead, he was a participant in a baroque and brilliantly exploitative economic system designed with a single purpose: to ensure that he, the man doing all the actual work, remained perpetually bound to his post, a serf with a trapline instead of a plow. The entire economy of the fur trade revolved around a unit of currency known as the made beaver, or MB. This was not a coin you could put in your pocket. It was a standard of value, a hypothetical, perfect quality, prime winter, adult beaver pelt. Every other good, from a musket ball to a wool blanket, and every other pelt, from a marten to a mangy fox, was priced in fractions or multiples of this theoretical made beaver. Angus didn't earn money. He earned credit, a line item in a ledger, denominated in a currency whose value was determined by the very people to whom he was permanently indebted. It was a closed loop, a company town the size of Western Europe. Let's revisit that soul-crushing annual meeting with the chief factor, but this time, let's look at it through the cold lens of accounting. Angus arrives, his canoe laden with what he, in his naive optimism, estimates to be 100 made beaver worth of fur. This is the culmination of a year's misery. Every frozen finger, every near starvation night, every terrifying encounter with a predator is bundled up in these pelts. He presents them with a flicker of hope. Perhaps this is the year he finally clears his debt. The factor then begins his theatrical appraisal. He holds up a magnificent otter pelt. An excellent specimen McTavish, he might concede, allowing a sliver of hope to enter the room. Unfortunately, the market in London is rather saturated with otter this season. We can only offer you 2 megabytes for it. Never mind that the official company standard says a prime otter is worth 3. The market, as the factor explained it, was a mysterious and fickle beast, and its whims always, coincidentally, favored the company's profit margin. He moves on to the beaver pelts. He finds a small nick here, a patch of thin fur there. This is barely a 3/4 beaver, he'd declare, tossing it on the pile. By the time the farce was over, Angus's 100-pelt haul had been systematically devalued through a combination of creative grading and market fluctuations to perhaps 60 made beaver. His expected earnings had been slashed by 40% before he even had a chance to spend them. And oh, how he would spend them. The second act of this economic tragedy took place at the company store, a dim, cluttered room managed by that same sneering clerk. His 60 megabytes of credit were now to be spent on his outfit, the supplies he needed to survive another year in the bush. And everything had a price set not by supply and demand, but by corporate decree. A new musket, which the company might have purchased in bulk from a Birmingham factory for a few shillings, would cost him the equivalent of 20 made beaver, a third of his entire year's earnings. A wool blanket, woven by the yard in England, cost 5 megabytes. Gunpowder, lead shot, flour, salt, a new iron kettle to replace the one that finally cracked, a small keg of that cheap, rot-gut rum that was both his only pleasure and his worst enemy. The list went on. The clerk would tally it all with a smug satisfaction, his quill scratching away in the great heavy ledger that was the true record of Angus's life. Let's see. Your 60 megabytes in earnings, less 75 megabytes for your outfit and sundries. So you'll be starting this season with a balance of negative 15 megabytes, carried over from your previous debt. We do appreciate your continued service, McTavish. He would be handed his supplies, the tools of his own continued indenturement, and sent back into the wilderness, not as a proud, independent trapper, but as a debtor fleeing ever deeper into the red. The ledger was not a record book, it was a leash. And herein lies the grand, cosmic irony of his existence. Angus McTavish, a man who lived in a smoky hovel, whose clothes were infested with lice, and whose diet would make a prisoner riot, was the foundational pillar of a global luxury goods market. Let us follow the journey of one of his perfect beaver pelts. From his hands, it went onto an HBC ship, a hardy three-masted vessel that would brave the ice and storms of the Hudson Strait and the North Atlantic. It would arrive weeks later at the London docks, where it would be sold at a bustling, frenetic auction house. A wealthy merchant would purchase it, part of a massive lot, for a price that would have staggered Angus. That pelt would then travel to a master hatter, who would, through a complex and mercury-laden process of felting, transform it into a magnificent, glossy, broad-brimmed beaver hat. Picture a duke standing before a gilt-edged mirror in his lavish London townhouse, adjusting this very hat. It is the height of fashion, a symbol of his wealth and status. The hat cost him a fortune. The hatter who made it earned a handsome living. The merchant who imported it was growing rich. The shareholders of the Hudson's Bay Company were receiving handsome dividends. And Angus, the man who endured a year of brutal, life-threatening hardship to acquire that single piece of fur, was at that very moment likely huddled in a freezing lean-to, suffering from scurvy and trying to decide if he could afford to use a full measure of powder to shoot a rabbit for dinner. He was the unseen, unacknowledged, and uncompensated engine of empire, hauling a kingdom's wealth for nothing more than crumbs and continued debt. His already precarious existence was further buffeted by forces he couldn't possibly comprehend. A rumor would trickle into the fort that the King of France had taken a new mistress who favored silk bonnets. Suddenly, the demand for beaver felt in Paris would plummet. The company, ever vigilant of its profits, would not absorb this loss. It would be passed directly down. The next year, the factor would inform Angus that due to a softening in the European markets, a prime beaver pelt was now worth half of what it was last season. He could work twice as hard and end up twice as poor, all because of a change in sartorial tastes an ocean away. A war between England and Spain could see HBC ships captured by privateers, meaning the supply ship with his flour and gunpowder might never arrive. The whims of kings, the outcomes of distant battles, the gossip of European courts. All of these could spell his doom, and he was utterly powerless to influence any of it. He was a man playing a high-stakes game where he didn't know the rules, couldn't see the other players, and was betting his life with a hand he was guaranteed to lose. The concept of progress is a human invention, a comforting story we tell ourselves about moving forward, improving our lot, and building towards a better future. This story had no place in the life of Angus MacTavish. His existence was not a line, but a circle. It was a grand, repeating cycle of misery, tethered to the turning of the seasons, each one bringing its own specialized flavor of hardship. He was not on a journey of discovery. He was on a commute to hell, and upon arrival, his only task was to turn around and begin the commute all over again. Imagine his year, not as a series of events, but as a single Sisyphean loop. It begins in the late summer or early autumn, with the grueling paddle into the wilderness. The canoe is heavy now, not with the dry, lightweight wealth of furs, but with the dense, heavy burden of survival. Sacks of flour, kegs of gunpowder, iron traps, and the crushing weight of his renewed debt to the company. Every paddle stroke away from the fort is a stroke deeper into his prison. This is the hopeful season, if one could call it that. There is a sense of grim purpose as he establishes his wintering ground, building his miserable hovel, and setting out his first trap lines. It is the purpose of a man building his own gallows, meticulously checking the quality of the rope. Then comes winter, the long, static heart of his suffering. Time itself seems to congeal. The days are short, the nights are an eternity. His world shrinks to the size of his smoky hut and the familiar, grueling path of his trapline. The work is endless. The trapping, the skinning, the scraping, the curing, the constant, desperate battle for firewood. It is a slow, white agony, a period of profound isolation, where the passage of time is marked only by the phases of the moon and the slow depletion of his flour sack. It is a sensory deprivation tank, filled with frozen mud and despair. Spring arrives not as a gentle rebirth, but as a violent, chaotic cataclysm known as the breakup. The rivers, frozen for months, heave and shatter with a sound like artillery fire. The world dissolves into a treacherous mess of rushing water, floating ice floes, and sucking mud. For Angus, this is the frantic harvest. He must rush to collect his traps before the rivers sweep them away, gathering the frozen, stiff carcasses of his winter's work. The hovel becomes an abattoir as he works day and night to process the final pelts. The urgency is not one of excitement, but of desperation. He is a man racing against nature's clock, a clock whose alarm is a flood that could wipe out his entire year's work. Finally, summer. He loads the canoe, now miraculously light, with the carefully bundled and dried pelts. The journey out of the wilderness begins. It is the same journey as the one in, but in reverse. The same back-breaking portages, the same endless miles of paddling. Only now he is haunted by the gnawing anxiety of the factor's appraisal. He arrives at the trading post, endures the ritual of economic violation, watches his year of suffering get tallied and found wanting, and sinks deeper into the company's books. He stocks his canoe with the familiar heavy supplies. And then, the ultimate soul-crushing act of the cycle. He turns his canoe around and points it right back into the wilderness. He paddles away from the fort, every stroke taking him back to the same trapping ground to repeat the entire agonizing process for another year. He was Sisyphus in a canoe. His boulder was a bundle of furs, and at the top of the hill stood the Hudson's Bay Company, ready to kick it right back to the bottom. He was a prisoner, not of walls and bars, but of rhythms. His life was tethered to the grand, indifferent gears of the natural world. He couldn't decide to take a season off, to To do so would be to starve. He was as much a part of the ecosystem's cycle as the migrating caribou or the spawning salmon. Their movements dictated his movements. Their lives dictated his life. The landscape itself, for all its seeming openness, was a cage. He was free to wander a territory the size of a continent. But that freedom was an illusion. His paths were dictated by the flow of rivers, the placement of impassable rapids, the sweep of vast trackless muskeg. His trapline was not a trail of exploration. It was the worn groove of a beast in its pen. He wasn't a pioneer. He was a human cog in a great grinding machine of seasons and commerce, destined to turn until his teeth wore down and he broke. And yet, it would be an insult to the complexity of the human spirit to suggest that his life contained nothing but pure, unadulterated misery. That would be too simple. For even in the deepest, darkest pit of daily suffering, the mind can find the tiniest, most improbable cracks of light. These were not moments of happiness. Happiness is a foreign country. No, these were fleeting, intensely personal moments of what could only be called grim satisfaction. They were tiny, gasping breaths of air in an ocean of suffocation. This satisfaction was born not of joy, but of competence. In a life defined by powerlessness, the one thing a man could occasionally control was the quality of his own work. Consider the intellectual puzzle of setting a trap. To successfully catch a fox or a marten, you had to outthink it. You had to understand the wind, the scent, the subtle contours of the land, the creature's habits and fears. To find your trap sprung the next day, the animal caught cleanly, was a moment of profound, quiet vindication. It was a silent declaration. Today, in this one small way, I imposed my will upon the chaos. I was smarter than this corner of the wilderness. There was a deep, abiding pride in the mastery of essential skills, to be able to read the clouds, the behavior of the birds, and the color of the evening sky, to accurately predict an incoming blizzard, wasn't just a neat trick. It was a life-saving act of prophecy. It was a dialogue with the environment on its own terms. To take a canoe, ripped open on a sharp, unseen rock, its skin gaping and wounded, and to patiently, expertly patch it with heated spruce gum and strips of leather, making it whole and watertight again. This was a powerful act of order and creation. It was a small but potent defiance of the entropy that was constantly trying to tear him and his world apart. These moments were almost always solitary, but the rarest and most potent form of this satisfaction was the one that was shared. After months of silence, to sit across a fire from another man who had endured the same trials, and to share a joke so dark it was almost a prayer, was a powerful affirmation. To complain about the factor's stinginess, or the poor quality of the gunpowder, and to see the immediate, knowing nod of understanding in another's eyes, was to feel, for a fleeting moment, not alone. It was a communion of the damned, a tiny spark of shared humanity warming itself against a universe of cold. These weren't moments of joy. They were moments of profound validation. They were the quiet, internal acknowledgments that, despite the debt, the hunger, and the crushing loneliness, he was still a man of immense skill and unbreakable resilience. He was good at his job, and his job was survival. The Canadian wilderness is a ruthless accountant. For decades, it had been extending a line of credit to Angus McTavish, and for decades, he had been making the interest payments with his youth, his health, and his spirit. But the wilderness, like the Hudson's Bay Company, is not in the business of forgiveness. Eventually the principal comes due, and the body itself is the final collateral. The long, slow process of decay that began the moment he first stepped into a canoe was now entering its final, accelerated phase. The warranty on his body had expired, and every moving part was beginning to fail at once. It started in his lungs. The chronic hacking cough that had been his companion for years had deepened, maturing into a constant, chest-rattling affair that shook his entire frame. In the sub-zero air, every breath felt like inhaling a lungful of powdered glass. He could no longer paddle for hours, his powerful rhythm a memory. Now, he was forced to stop every 15 minutes, gasping, his lungs burning, a thin, pinkish foam occasionally flecking his lips. The other men, younger men, would glide past him, their faces a mixture of pity and impatience. He, who had once been among the strongest, was now being left behind. His joints, those faithful barometers of every coming storm, had moved beyond simple agony into outright rebellion. The arthritis had settled into his knuckles, his knees, and his hips, like a malevolent tenant who refuses to be evicted. Simple tasks became monumental struggles. Gripping the smooth, worn handle of his axe sent a shockwave of fiery pain up his arm. Kneeling to set a trap was a slow, agonizing process, and getting back up was even worse. His hands, once his most valuable tools, were becoming gnarled, useless claws, the fingers permanently swollen and bent, refusing to obey his commands. His senses, honed to a razor's edge by decades of survival, were dulling. His eyesight, assaulted for years by the blinding glare of sun on snow and the perpetual sting of wood smoke, was now a blurry, untrustworthy haze. He could no longer spot the subtle flicker of a deer's ear in the undergrowth, or distinguish a bear track from a shadow at a distance. The world was losing its sharpness, its vital details fading into a fuzzy, indistinct menace. His hearing, too, was failing, the high-pitched sounds gone completely, replaced by a constant low hum. He was becoming deaf to the whispers of the forest, the snap of a twig that might signal a predator, or the call of a bird that might signal a change in the weather. He was being unplugged from the world he had mastered, becoming a stranger in his own land. The psychological toll of this decline was perhaps the cruelest blow. He, a man whose entire identity was built on self-reliance and physical competence, was becoming weak. The moment of true, soul-crushing realization might have come during a portage, as a younger man hoisted a canoe to his shoulders with a grunt and set off at a brisk trot. Angus might have struggled to even lift his own pack, his back screaming in protest, his legs trembling. In that moment, he would have seen himself through the other men's eyes. No longer a peer, but a burden, an old man, obsolete. And he would see that same recognition in the cold, assessing gaze of the chief factor at the fort. The factor's eyes would no longer hold the look of a superior appraising an asset, but the look of a man evaluating a worn-out tool, a tool that was no longer productive, that was costing more in rations than it was producing in furs. There was no pension plan with the Hudson's Bay Company. There was no gold watch and a handshake. When you could no longer pull your weight, you were simply finished. Your debt to the company might be magnanimously forgiven, a final cynical act of charity that was really just the writing off of a bad investment. You would be left to haunt the fort, a ghost in a worn-out coat, doing odd menial jobs for table scraps, a cautionary tale for the new recruits. Your career didn't end in glory. It just fizzled out into irrelevance and quiet despair. But what if there was another option? What if there was a way to perpetuate one's legacy? Let us imagine that Angus, in his long years, had taken a wife from a local Cree community, a woman whose family had shown him more kindness than his own employers ever had. And from this union, there is a son, a boy, now a young man, who possesses his mother's knowledge of the land and his father's stubborn constitution. This boy is his father's pride and his father's deepest, most profound shame. As Angus felt his own strength wane, he would look at his son, strong, straight-backed, his eyes clear and sharp, and a bitter, complex brew of emotions would churn in his gut. There was love, fierce and deep, but it was poisoned by a wave of crushing guilt. He knew with a certainty that chilled him more than any winter wind what he had to do. There was no other life for his son, no other way to provide. The company was the only economy. The traps were the only tools. And so, with a heart as heavy as a waterlogged log, he would begin the process of shackling his own child to the same life that had broken him. He would take the boy out on the trap line, the harsh guttural sounds of his own long-dead mentor echoing in his throat. No, not there. The wind is wrong, you fool. The beaver will smell you a mile away, he'd bark, his voice rough with something the boy might mistake for anger, but which was in fact desperation. Faster with that axe. Do you want to freeze before the shelter is built? Every harsh word was a twisted act of love, a frantic attempt to hammer the brutal lessons of survival into his son's mind before the wilderness could teach him with a fatal blow. And the son, for his part, would look at his father and see not a teacher, but a prophecy. He saw the stooped shoulders, the gnarled hands that could barely hold a cup, the hacking cough that was the soundtrack to their evenings. He felt the biting cold in his own fingers, the gnawing hunger in his own belly, and in his father's ruined face. He saw his own reflection in 30 years' time. It was a moment of dawning, dreadful clarity. The torch was being passed, but it was not a torch of glory or honor. It was heavy. It was greasy with the fat of 1,000 dead animals, and it burned the hand that was forced to hold it. The cycle would be completed at the fort. Angus would stand behind his son, a silent, stooped shadow, as the boy stood before the factor's desk. The boy would dip a quill in the ink, and with a hesitant hand, he would draw an X on the line of the contract, the same X his father had drawn a lifetime ago. The clerk would smile that same thin, contemptuous smile. The factor would nod, a new asset acquired, and Angus would watch, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest, as the great, grinding, indifferent machine he had served his entire life claimed his son. The man was disposable. The misery was inheritable. The cycle was eternal. Generals and kings, politicians and merchant princes, their names are carved into the stone of monuments and stamped onto the pages of history books. We see their portraits in art galleries, their faces powdered and serene, their gazes confident and commanding. They are the architects of empire, the men who drew the maps and built the great edifices of state. We see the tangible results of their ambition, the grand halls of London, the powerful navies that ruled the waves, the sprawling, confident lines drawn across the globe that claimed entire continents for a crown an ocean away. But beneath the shadow of every colossal statue, beneath the foundation of every magnificent palace, lies the unrecorded sweat and sinew of countless forgotten people. And among the most forgotten of all is our man, Angus MacTavish. He is the ant beneath the obelisk, the silent, laboring foundation upon which the grand structure was built. He wore no crown and commanded no army. His greatest ambition was not to conquer a nation, but to survive the winter. His most significant geopolitical act was choosing a spot for his trap line. And yet, without his relentless, monotonous, and soul-destroying toil, and the toil of thousands of men exactly like him, the economic engine of a vast portion of the British Empire would have sputtered and failed. The beaver felt hat, that symbol of European status and respectability, was more than just fashion. It was the widget that drove a continent-spanning machine of extraction. The pursuit of the beaver was the driving force behind much of the exploration of North America. The paths Angus beat through the bush to his trapping grounds, the rivers he navigated, the portage trails he cleared. These were the first faint pencil sketches of the future map of Canada and the northern United States. He was an unknowing pioneer, an unpaid surveyor, an unwitting agent of colonial expansion. He sought not to claim the land for king and country, but simply to find a quiet spot where the beaver were plentiful and the wind didn't bite so hard. Yet in doing so, he helped stitch a new nation into existence with the thread of his own misery. His name, of course, is lost to us. Angus MacTavish is a fiction, a convenient handle for a ghost. His real name was never chiseled in granite or cast in bronze. It was written in scratchy ink, in a heavy ledger book, a book that has long since been consumed by fire or mold, or the simple indifferent decay of time. His body, broken by decades of labor, lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in the vastness of the Canadian Shield. Perhaps it was a shallow pit scratched out of the frozen earth near his final winter camp, or perhaps he was simply consumed by the wilderness he had for so long struggled against. His bones have long since returned to the soil, his dust mingling with the dust of the countless animals he hunted. As an individual, he has been utterly and completely erased from the historical record. And yet, his legacy is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. It is in the names of the places he traveled, the rivers, the lakes, the rapids that still bear the descriptive, practical names given to them by the men who navigated them. His legacy is in the very placement of modern cities, many of which sprouted from the humble, palisaded trading posts he supplied. He is in the DNA of the culture, in the romantic, rugged myths of the frontiersmen that persist to this day, myths that, in their sanitized glory, serve only to obscure the brutal reality of his actual existence. Think of history as a great deep river. The famous figures, the generals, the politicians, the inventors, they are the grand ships that sail upon its surface. We see their flags, we read their names on the hulls, we marvel at the wake they leave behind. But the river itself, the powerful, deep, inexorable current that carries all these ships forward, is the collective effort of millions upon millions of forgotten souls. Our trapper was not a ship. He was a single, anonymous drop of water. But he joined with millions of other drops, in millions of other forgotten lives of toil and endurance, to create the very current that moved history itself. He didn't just witness the events from the riverbank. He was the river. He didn't just live through an era. He physically powered it, one agonizing paddle stroke, one frozen trap, one crushing portage at a time. So, the next time you marvel at the enduring wilderness of North America, or see a beaver in a quiet stream, or pull on a warm winter coat, spare a thought for the forgotten trapper. His life was not a grand adventure. It was a grueling, monotonous, and often terrifying job, performed for a company that exploited him and a society that never knew his name. He sought no glory and received none. He lived in poverty so that others could grow rich. He endured unimaginable hardship so that a gentleman in London could have a fashionable hat. But to see him only as a victim, only as a poor, suffering soul, is to do him a final injustice. For in his unceasing labor, in his stubborn, mule-headed refusal to simply lie down and die, in his profound and hard-won competence, he was more than just a sufferer. He was a fundamental part of the great unseen engine that powered a civilization. We marvel at the gleaming automobile of progress, but we forget the hot, greasy, and dangerous engine room where the real work is done. He lived his life in that engine room, his existence a constant scream of fire and pressure. His life burned as fuel to turn the great wheels of commerce and empire. He wasn't just a drop in the river. He was a spark in the silt, a testament to the astonishing, terrifying, and ultimately tragic resilience of the human spirit. His name is forgotten, but his collective contribution is eternal.